Now, of course, as Husserl is wont to do, he'll say, okay, well, they got so far, but then they didn't fully get there. So the skeptical impulse, or this first transcendental impulse, does not mature into its full importance, and that process of maturing, the transcendental impulse maturing into its full manifestation, really comes back around with Descartes. In modern philosophy and with Descartes, skepticism reappears in a new guise, not as a sort of relativity of knowledge to the subject, but as radical subjectivism, which are two very different things. Hopefully, you have some familiarity with the distinction between ancient kinds of skepticism and modern external world skepticism, which we find in Descartes. The idea there being that if we try to subject all of our beliefs to doubt, we won't be able to do it because they're too numerous. So we try to think about whether there are any beliefs that kind of sit at the foundation of the rest and give the rest their stability. And if those kind of very deep fundamental beliefs are subject to doubt, then so must everything. That doubt is inherited by the rest of the beliefs that are less fundamental. So for Descartes, the most fundamental thing is that I trust my senses to give me good information about my environment. And if we find that we actually can doubt that our senses are giving us good information about our environment, and that challenges for Descartes something that is so fundamental to philosophy and science, which is that evidence provides a guide to the truth. So our most fundamental kind of evidence is that we see, we perceive, we have sensory experience, and can a philosopher explain the Cartesian challenges? Can a philosopher explain why there's a necessary, or what the necessary connection is between evidence and truth, so that we think that if we have the best possible evidence, then that is a reliable guide to the truth, or at the very least is the best, better than making claims in the absence of evidence. In Ideas 1, Husserl introduces the phenomenological epoché. That's a Greek word meaning suspension of judgment or suspension of belief. We'll get to that in a moment. This is an aspect of phenomenological method, and it sets us up to redirect our attention away from the objects to the cognizing of them, or the experience of them. So again, it's a kind of self-conscious, self-reflective adoption of a non-naive attitude or approach to science and philosophy. And so we redirect our attention from the objects to our consciousness of them. And this is what the first step of that process is called epoché. For example, the Pyrrhonian skeptics use this term, where it refers to the suspension of belief or the suspension of judgment, and that involves not taking a stand at all. So it's important to understand that the ancient skeptics practiced epoché by suspending judgment, neither saying yes nor no, and they had various reasons for thinking that suspension of judgment was the wisest response to the state of human inquiry. And by invoking this term, Husserl's clearly situating himself in that skeptical lineage. Of course, he himself is not a skeptic, but he does think that skepticism, as I've said, is what brings us to shatter naivete and become aware of subjectivity. Now, for Husserl, epoché isn't about suspending judgment about one or a couple of questions, or about one kind of subject matter. For example, we might, if we were agnostics, or we might suspend judgment about questions of religion. But for Husserl, there's a very specific epoché that he's after. And it has to do with our naive acceptance of the existence of the world. This is what Husserl calls the natural attitude We go around and we just simply take things as they are presented to us. So when I see a tree outside the window, I just kind of implicitly assume the tree exists. Now, importantly, obviously I could have any number of aberrations that get me to question that. It could flicker in and out of existence. I could notice that I'm not wearing my glasses and the rest of it. But in general, there's this sort of abiding sense that what we see is real, then that the world exists, whether or not we're looking at it. And this is, again, what Husserl calls the natural attitude. So it's this general sense that the world exists. And when I look at it and see the tree, I don't sort of piecemeal think about the tree's existence. It just seems to exist because it's part of this world that just seems to exist, and there's just no real reason to question that in the natural attitude. So that the world exists is not, for Husserl, primarily the content of a judgment. It's not something that we run through our mind and formulate the proposition, the world exists, and then we affirm that proposition. Again, it's just a default way that underwrites our entire form of living. It's continuously operative throughout waking life, and it's not anything that we need to bring to mind. And we can bring it to mind, but that's not that's irrelevant to phenomenology. So even if you've never thought one time in your entire life about whether the world exists or not, you're in the natural attitude just by virtue of living in the way that people always live. We jump out of the way of danger, and we try to pursue the things that we find good, and we orient our day around those kinds of natural attitude concerns. Now, one reason why we don't often judge that the world exists in an explicit act is that doing so is simply unmotivated. And we can imagine local cases in which it is motivated. If you have a particularly vivid dream in which you see you see the book of Revelations play out in front of you, and the world disappears, and then you wake up and you say, the world does exist. So we can imagine local odd cases in which we are motivated to make that judgment. But we're not interested in like the logical properties of that proposition in phenomenology. We're interested in the natural attitude and how that gains its legitimacy. And so Husserl thinks whatever we would be doing if we were to make a judgment that says the world exists and to affirm that, there's some sort of shared intentional structure between an explicit judgment that the world exists and the implicit natural attitude which takes the world to exist as an unquestioned basis for the rest of our cognitive activities and practical activities. So whatever it is that there's some sort of intentional structure that underwrites our general implicit or explicit belief in the existence of the world. And so that's what Husserl wants to explore, is the intentional structure which underlies the belief in the existence of the world. And it's super important, again, to point out that this is not just a judgment to be analyzed logically, but an intentional structure that forms the basis for our naive cognitive activities. So, for example, if you're a chemist, you never need to formulate the judgment for the sake of your science. You never need to formulate the judgment that the world exists. But you do need to believe that chemicals exist in the world just to go about your science. If you were to start questioning whether chemicals exist, then you'd be doing philosophy. You would no longer be in the province of chemistry. So chemistry just has to presuppose that province and get to work on it. So that's what I mean when I say it's not an explicit judgment that we're interested in, which will have logical properties like well-formedness or inferential structure. It is rather that underlying cognitive, precognitive attitude. So Husserl, what is the relationship to skepticism? Well, immediately, if we're going to be talking so much about the world's existence, you might think that, okay, what we're going to do as phenomenologists is become skeptical about whether the world exists and try to prove that it does. No, Husserl doesn't think that that's the right way to go. His idea is that what he's going to do with skepticism here in Ideas 1 is he's going to look at it as what he calls a methodic expedient. So Husserl finds a complex structure, complex intentional structure in Cartesian doubt. And he wants to kind of use that touch point. Everyone's familiar in philosophy with Descartes. So he wants to sort of think about why he would bring up skepticism and Descartes here. Even though he's not a skeptic and he's not going to do a skeptical procedure. So why is he bringing it up? Well, it's a common kind of touch point for his audience. And Husserl thinks that there is some crucial kernel in Cartesian doubt that he's extracting, and he says he points out that doubt is a multifaceted phenomenon. It's got a multifaceted, layered intentional structure, and so if we can kind of tease apart exactly what cognitive operations are involved in Descartes' methodological doubt, then maybe we can kind of see what's useful from that. So the intentional structure of doubting first has to be distinguished from, say, a logical negation. We don't go from the world exists to the world does not exist. That's not doubt. That's just another certainty which contains a negation. So, for example, if I say that there's ice cream in the fridge or in the freezer, hopefully, and then I eat it and I say there's no ice cream in the fridge, in the freezer, that isn't passing from certainty to doubt. That's passing from one certainty to another certainty with a distinctive propositional content, negation in there. So negation is not doubting. Negation is another form of certainty. So it's also to be distinguished logic from modes of certainty, namely, say, uncertainty or possibility, probability. An example here would be I might modalize my certainty. I might be certain that my friend has arrived for the party upon hearing his distinctive engine roaring outside. I know that this person has this specific motorcycle, and I conclude, hear the motorcycle, I conclude my friend is here. And then someone at the party tells me, hey, John just got a very similar motorcycle. So now my certainty that my friend is here has been modalized into probability. It's probably him, or maybe I'm just 50-50. It could be him, or maybe it's not. So I've gone from certainty to uncertainty to probability. That is not doubt in the Cartesian sense anyway. There is a sense in which we could say what I've come to is to doubt whether my friend is there or not. But Cartesian doubt is not like that. And it can't be like that because, this modalization from certainty to uncertainty about whether my friend has arrived, the party, is a motivated, doubt modalization. It issues from the immediate situation of my life world. It's not something that I've artificially constructed. On the other hand, a Cartesian meditation is in some sense very artificial. You don't go into a Cartesian meditation because you are walking out in the world and something makes you unsure. You go into a Cartesian meditation in a controlled, willful fashion, and that kind of modalization to just in an unmotivated way, just because you want to pass from certainty to uncertainty, that is not possible as far as Husserl is concerned. So, for example, if I'm sitting here and looking out the window at a tree, I can't just will myself to decide to be uncertain about whether it's there. there are all kinds of natural things that could happen that would modalize my certainty. Again, it suddenly disappears and reappears. I see someone, working on constructing facades of other trees nearby, and I think, gee, is that tree a facade as well? These are all potential reasons why I might modalize my certainty, but I can't just sit here and decide to do it. I could tell myself I'm doing that, but Husserl thinks that is a misfire. It's false to kind of willfully modalize in that way. And doubt doesn't consist in a negation either. So what else? Another thing you might say is that doubt is being certain and uncertain at the same time. Husserl thinks that this is impossible. Now, there's an intuitive way of thinking about that where, sure, it's coherent in certain contexts to describe yourself as being certain and uncertain, a kind of ambivalence or being torn between two options. But to speak strictly in a phenomenological sense, in a philosophical sense, Husserl thinks that that we should say it's impossible, strictly speaking, to have certainty and uncertainty coexist at the same time. So it's impossible to be certain that the world exists and to doubt it at the same time, in the sense to be certain and uncertain. On the other hand, it does seem like I can sort of willfully conduct my inquiry as though the certainty I have wasn't operative. I can go outside and examine the tree as though my certainty had fallen away. Now, Husserl concludes that Descartes' doubting procedure must not be a simple intentional on-off switch. It's got to be a multifaceted phenomenon. It can't be understood as a simple modalization of belief, nor can it be understood as the coexistence of two different modalities, certainty and uncertainty. So it must be a sort of a layered, multi-dimensional kind of intentional structure. And Husserl thinks that there must be two elements, at least. First, there must be what he calls the suspension of positing. So what we want to do here is contrast suspension of positing with being uncertain or doubting in the usual sense. Now, suppose you had posited an object in an uncertain modality. So the tree, you're not sure whether it exists or not. Your inquiry can now be guided by that uncertain positing. And it would look different than your inquiry would look if it was motivated by a suspension of positing. So we have uncertain positing, a type of positing, and we have a suspension of positing, where positing is just not made use of at all. So one mode of inquiry arises from uncertainty, positing something in an uncertain way, versus suspension of positing, the other inquiry. Now, phenomenological inquiry is the suspension of positing, not whatever shape of inquiry would arise from uncertain positing. So intuitively, you can imagine if I uncertainly posit the tree, then I might investigate it, and I would do so in order to satisfy my curiosity about whether it exists or not. On the other hand, my inquiry would be shaped in a much different way if I just suspended, if I just didn't care whether the tree existed or not. And in that case, I wouldn't be inquiring into it with the aim of deciding whether it exists. I'd be inquiring into it with some other aim, and that's what phenomenology is all about. Now, Husserl concludes that Descartes' doubt must have at least two aspects in its intentional structure. The first is the suspension of positing, or the epoché, the bracketing of the existence of the object. And the second is the supposition of non-being or negation. So Descartes actually pairs a suspension with a negation Now, Husserl thinks the negation aspect of Cartesian doubt is somewhat of a distraction, and he even says it predominates so much in Descartes' discussion that he even says Descartes' attempt to doubt universally is properly an attempt to negate universally. Here in phenomenology, we disregard that part. What interests us is that aspect of Cartesian doubt, which was the suspension. The suspension of positing aspect is what makes Cartesian doubt sensical. It's what means we're not both certain and uncertain at the same time, nor are we sort of artificially and in an unmotivated fashion declaring ourselves or playing at being in doubt when in fact there is no motivated modalization present. And that makes it clear that suspension or some kind of procedure of suspension of existence is completely compatible with an ongoing certainty in the existence of the world. So there's no requirement in phenomenological cognition that we somehow bandy about a false and an artificial questioning or doubting about whether the world exists. The question of certain positing and the question of the suspension of the positing are independent. We can have any mixture of the two. So Husserl takes one aspect of Cartesian doubt and dispenses completely with the other, the negating aspect. You'll notice if you read Descartes' original Meditations, Descartes says, I have convinced myself for the sake of these meditations that there is no sky, there is no earth, I have no body. Descartes, should say, Husserl does not do anything of the sort. There's no negation. He never says we presume that the world doesn't exist and proceed forth from there. We simply suspend the positing. So it's also, Husserl is quick to point out that the result, that the suspension or the epoché is to be distinguished from imagination. It doesn't mean that we are just imagining the world. There's a sense in which there's a resonance between phenomenological epoché and imagination, in the sense that both are we can carry on both without any concern about positing, but we can't. This isn't just a form of imagination. We can't go into depth on exactly why that's the case here. It would take us into another topic. It's a subtle question. It's a difficult question, and it is true that phenomenological epoché and imagination are deeply related. They're just distinct cognitive activities. Okay, so we can see that Husserl positions himself in a less direct way in the tradition and lineage of skepticism here. He does that in at least two ways. He uses the term, he appropriates the term epoché from the ancient skeptics. I think he does that for very specific reasons. And he appropriates and picks apart Descartes' universal doubting procedure, which is obviously a notorious skeptical procedure. And while Husserl is not doing a skeptical procedure here, and while he's very careful, as I just shown, to say that Descartes' procedure packages more in, and Husserl is trying to just pull one specific element out of it, we can see that it's very much related to the history of skepticism and to the sense in which skepticism is a destabilization of naivete. What we're doing here is suspending or bracketing or the natural attitude, suspending or bracketing naivete, but not with any destructive aims. We don't have the end of showing that human inquiry is ultimately futile or anything like that. Now, this is the least sort of explicitly skeptical discussion of phenomenological epoché of the ones that we'll be discussing here. But what we want to do now is show how the transcendental insight, which is again the way in which